Hello, people. This is Chris VK3AML. For those of you who don't know how this works, at exactly 9:30, which is in 2 minutes' time, I have a regular Saturday night session on the 2-meter ham band, which is from that transmitter that I'm pointing at. And each week we try to fill a bit of the Saturday night hours with historical audio. Drawn from various sources, a little bit this week on the history of the Titanic sinking, as recalled by the people who were actually there. And then at about 10 p.m, I'll be playing the surviving recordings of Sir Ernest Shackleton and some interviews with the people that were with him on that famous trip from their ship being wrecked in 1916 to rescue via a whaling station at South Georgia Island in the South Atlantic, one of the great epics of modern exploration. But I see it's 9:29, and when it ticks over to 9:30, I'll hit the transmit button and we'll start the transmission as we do each week. And hello to anybody who might be looking in. I think there's one person at this stage. 9:29 still. I hope the audio levels are okay. They're a little bit higher this week than they've been in previous weeks, and I just hope we're not overloading. Okay, it's 9:30. Hello, this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima, VK3AML. With the usual Saturday night test transmission. Hope everybody's had a good week. I've just had an afternoon with Steve, VK3SL, and various other hams at a ham fest, a sort of a car boot sale on a massive scale at Moorabbin, which I hope everybody enjoyed. I only bought about $10 worth of bits. Others were going out with all sorts of stuff. I know that Dave, VK3ASE, was exiting with huge quantities of cavity resonators, which I very much envy him getting because I could use them here for crossbanding. I'll try not to keep it too technical this week. I know that there are a few newies that'll be looking in, and welcome to them. As an explanation to this, I worked for the better part of 45 years with vintage audio materials, specialised in vintage audio materials and later film, in making historical documentaries of one type or another. And even now in retirement, I lecture in the history of film, sound recording, television, to organisations like U3A, Probus, local historical societies. I've done quite a few of those, Camberwell, Baldwin, Heidelberg, to name only a few. So if anybody is interested in following up, getting a lecturer through some part of the year, talking, for example, about early films of Melbourne, I have a half-hour compilation of Melbourne films, starting with the 1896 Melbourne Cup and finishing with the first talkie documentaries and newsreels of Melbourne, which of course were made in 1929, 1930. I got quite a bit of reaction to the recording of the captain of the Carpathia that we played last week. The ship that rescued the survivors of the Titanic sinking. And as a result of requests to provide more about the Titanic if I could, I've dug into BBC archives as well as other sources to locate the eyewitness accounts of two significant people from the Titanic sinking. One is Lieutenant Boxall, who was, I think, first mate, and Lightoller, who was prominent in his rescue of people before plunging into the Pacific himself and swimming in ice-cold water to a collapsible life raft. It's an extraordinary story and one of several shipwrecks in which Lightoller was involved. At 11 o'clock, I'll be opening up 147.475 for QSOs, for conversations with other amateur radio operators on the air. So if anybody is interested in having a chat on 147.475, the frequency on which we're now transmitting, I hope, I'll just check my meters. Yep, all in order. And the cooling fans are, in fact, working. So, without any further ado, let's have a listen to a 1936 interview with Lightoller from the Titanic, recalling the day 24 years before when he was involved with the sinking of the Titanic, April 1912. This was from a series of BBC programs made in the 1930s. The ones that survive are absolutely fascinating, or at least I find them so. A series of recordings of people involved with historically significant events, and the BBC series was called I Was There, not surprisingly. Over to Lightoller.
I Was There, talks by men who saw the making of history. Nowadays, a passenger to America has no misgivings, but nearly a generation ago, a terrible catastrophe in mid-ocean had to mark the end of an era of peril in Atlantic transport. On the 15th of April, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg, and in a couple of hours, a great liner had sunk on her maiden voyage at a cost in human life of 1,500 souls. Commander Lightoller was second officer, and when he had seen the last of the insufficient lifeboats pull away from the ship, he plunged into the sea and was ultimately rescued. All the other officers who went down with the ship were drowned. Commander Lightoller.
Altogether, I have had 4 shipwrecks and a fire during my 30-odd years at sea. But by far and away the worst of them all was the one I'm going to tell you about now, the loss of the Titanic. I joined her in Belfast while she was still in the builder's hands, the biggest and finest ship in the world, and given the normal life of a ship, I'm pretty sure she would have proved the fastest. But let me say right here and now, neither that night nor that voyage were we out for any records. We ran our trials in Belfast Lough and then took her round to Southampton. On April the 10th, that's 1912, she sailed on her maiden and only voyage for New York. From the moment we left Belfast, we had marvelous weather. And even when we got out on the Western Ocean, or Atlantic, as you probably know it, it was as smooth as the proverbial mill pond, not a breath of wind, and the sea like a sheet of glass. In any other circumstances, those conditions would have been ideal. But anyone with experience of ice at sea knows that those very conditions, and the moonless night, only render the detection of icebergs all the more difficult, and calls for additional alertness on the part of both officers and men. Speaking for myself, I knew only too well that there were chances, if long ones, of sighting an iceberg, but as I reckon, in ample time to clear it with a turn of the wheel. On that night of April the 14th, we all, that is, the captain and officers, knew perfectly well that we were just about entering the region where ice might be sighted at that particular time of the year, and had taken all necessary precautions. Now, throughout the day, there had been the usual wireless messages from different ships reporting the weather, odd icebergs, and so forth. But as none of these bergs reported lay on our course, well, they didn't directly concern us. But when the evidence came to be sifted out at the inquiry held in London afterwards, it then came out that one very vital message received in the Titanic's wireless room that night had never been delivered to the bridge. That message came from a ship called the Masaba, warning all ships of heavy pack ice, icebergs, and field ice in an area then lying right ahead of the Titanic, and what was still worse, not far away. Those immense quantities of ice were abnormal for almost any time of the year, and the significance we should have attached to that report can hardly be exaggerated. In my opinion, it was a warning of the most vital importance. You see, I was officer of the watch and in charge of the ship when that Masaba message came over, and I know perfectly well what I should have done if it had come to my hand. Without a shadow of doubt, I should have slowed her down at once. That would have been imperative, and sent for the captain. More than likely, in fact almost certainly, he would have stopped the ship altogether and waited for daylight to feel his way through. Anyhow, the long and short of it is, neither he nor I nor any other officer of the ship got that message. Now to go on. We were steaming that night at a good 22 knots. At 10 o'clock, I was relieved as officer of the watch by Murdoch, W.M. Murdoch. He and I had been shipmates in many of the ocean greyhounds. And both of us had crossed this ice region times without number, both in clear weather and what's more in fog. After the usual formalities, I handed over, wished him joy of a few perishing cold hours, went below. I expect his watch went on as mine had done. Nothing to see, nothing to hear, except the distant roar of the water at her bows, that and the half-hourly bells with a lookoutman's cry of all's well. Of course, he knew nothing of the death trap lying ahead of us, any more than I did. And so 5 bells, 6 bells, and 7 bells went by. But barely 10 minutes had passed after the sound of the last bell when there were 3 sharp clangs on the crow's nest bell, followed by a cry from the lookout cage, "Ice right ahead, sir." Murdoch evidently saw the mass of ice practically at the same time as the lookout men and shouted, "Hard a starboard, full speed astern." His idea was to swing her bow clear and then put the helm hard over the other way and so swing her stern clear. And given half a chance, I believe he'd have done it. But going at that speed, it was too late. As it was, her bow swung a bit, but not enough, and she struck. She took the blow along her starboard side, masses of ice actually falling on the foredeck. But what was worse, though we didn't know that till it came out of the inquiry, she was pierced below the waterline in no less than 6 compartments, and from that moment, nothing could have saved her. I was lying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar, not any sense of collision, but more a kind of shiver that ran through the ship. Anyway, it was enough to bring me out of my bunk in one jump. Out on deck, I ran over one side and then to the other, but there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck. So back I went to my bunk and just waited. If I was wanted, naturally my cabin would be the first place where anyone sent for me would look. You see, apart from being nearly frozen, even an officer, when off watch, isn't exactly welcomed on the bridge, either in pajamas or anything else. Anyway, it wasn't long before Boxall, the 4th officer, poked his head round my door and said, "You know we've struck an iceberg." "I know you've struck something," I told him, not thinking it anything serious and feeling none too pleased. Then he said, "The water's up to F deck in the mailroom." There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater, and bridge coat and out on deck almost as soon as he was. Now we've been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve. And as a result, the steam roared off at all exhausts. The row was absolutely deafening. Added to that, the engineers started to blow the boilers down. Shout as loud as you like. No one could hear a word. At the same time that Boxall had called me, the order had been given, all hands on deck. And I met my watch tumbling up on the boat deck just as I got there. And the boat deck, just in case you don't know, is the top deck of all. I got hold of the boatswain's mate and sort of showed him with my hands that I wanted him to start the men stripping off the boat covers. Now, in the merchant service, men are taught to think and, if necessary, act for themselves. They don't wait for pipes or bugles, and I can tell you the 700-odd survivors of that night can thank God they don't. Every man jack just went about his job well as if it were an everyday occurrence. When the boats were stripped and cleared, they were swung out and lowered to the level of the boat deck. Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat. Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, "Why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them?" I told them it was merely a precaution, and that very likely they'd all be taken on board again at daylight, or at the worst, taken on board the ship everyone could clearly see, only a few miles away. We could see all her lights quite plainly. But here again we were up against it. That ship was the Californian, and though her lights were plain to everyone on board the Titanic, she seemed to pay not the slightest heed either to our wireless calls or to the distress signals we were firing every minute. The reason why she didn't answer our wireless calls, which other ships heard halfway around the earth, was because she only carried one wireless operator. And when we struck the iceberg, he'd just gone off watch, so it was no fault of his. But why no notice was taken of our distress signals, shells that are fired hundreds of feet up into the air to explode with a cascade of stars, heaven only knows. What a chance her captain missed. He could have laid his ship right alongside the Titanic and taken practically every soul on board. However, he didn't, and the two ships gradually drifted further and further apart. And according to the officer of the watch of the Californian, the Titanic's lights disappeared at 2:40 a.m. They did. And with his own eyes, he'd personally witnessed one of the greatest tragedies of the sea. But to go back again, at the time of getting away the first few boats, no one believed that the ship was actually in any danger. I'm afraid my own confidence that she wouldn't or couldn't sink rather conveyed itself to others, for there were actually cases where women absolutely refused to be put in a boat. I remember one young couple, evidently not long married, walking up and down the boat deck. I asked the girl, she was only a girl, from the western states, I should say, if I should put her in a boat. But no, she wouldn't be parted from her husband. Not on your life, she said. We've started together, and we'll finish together. Brave girl, but she didn't know how near that finish was. Certainly I didn't. As time went on, I could see the bows of the ship getting steadily lower and lower in the water. Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down a long stairway that led from the boat deck 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never likely to forget the sight of that cold greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway, Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and others, already submerged, were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency. But for my purpose, I could tell by that staircase measurement exactly what was happening, how far down she'd gone, and how quickly she was going. Just when I first realized how desperately serious things were, I don't know. But I do know that before many boats were away, I got to piling more and more people into them. Partly because I now knew she was going, and partly because the boats were not remaining by the ship to be filled to their full capacity when waterborne. A far easier job than lowering them with their full complement from that tremendous height. Another thing, it was plain to me that if we were going to avoid the unutterable disgrace of going down with boats still hanging at the davits, we'd got not only to take chances, but we got to work like blazes. I've always admired the coolness and efficiency of merchant sailors in the tight corners, and I've seen a few. But that night, well, the Titanic's men set up a standard that'll never be beaten. Every single boat was filled and lowered from davit head to water and got away without an accident of any kind. And that despite the pitch black night and the conditions we were working under. The same tribute must be paid to the passengers for the courage they showed. For by the time little more than half the boats had gone, I knew, and I'm pretty certain they knew, that she was definitely going down. You've got to remember, the Californian had drifted away. There weren't enough boats to take half the people, and the chances of the other half in that icy cold water were absolutely nil. Yet, there was never the slightest attempt to get into a boat out of turn. In fact, with the last couple of boats, it was even difficult to find women to fill them, though of course there were still a good many on board. Then came the very last boat of all, and it was a sort of raft with collapsible canvas sides, stowed upside down on top of the officers' quarters, and that's above the boat deck. A seaman named Hemming, he'd been with me in many of the mail boats, he and I cut this one adrift and threw it down on the water, which was now about 2 feet above the boat deck. Hemming, by the way, had earlier on given up his place in the boat after being told off to take charge of it, and unbeknown to me, had followed round, helping me with the lowering. A ticklish job even in daylight. Having dumped this collapsible, there was not a thing further we could do on that side, so both of us went over to the starboard side. But we found all the boats were away from there too. Of course, there were still hundreds of people round. As Hemming and I looked down from the top of the officers' quarters, where we were standing, the ship took a sudden dip, and a sea came rolling up, carrying everyone with it. Many were drowned there and then. Everyone that could just instinctively started to scramble up towards the after end of the ship. But that was only putting it off. In fact, it was lessening their chances. The plunge had to come, and that I could see was pretty soon. And no one's chances were going to be improved by getting mixed up in a struggling mass. Hemming, as I found out afterwards, headed for one of the after boat falls, slid down, dropped into the water, swam away, and was eventually saved. For my part, I turned forward and took a header from the top of the wheelhouse. I started to swim away, but got sucked down 2 or 3 times. In fact, I got mighty near the edge of things before I finally came up alongside the collapsible. We'd hove into the water from the top of the officers' quarters, and there I hung on. A bit later, the forward funnel guys carried away, and the funnel, weighing perhaps 50 or 60 tons, fell down with a crash on the water. It missed the raft and some of us hanging onto it by inches. But there were a good many it didn't miss. Next thing I remember, I was still hanging on to a bit of rope attached to the raft, but some 30 or 40 yards away from the ship. The wash of the falling funnel had evidently picked us up, raft and all, and flung us clear of the ship altogether. Several of us scrambled up onto the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink. As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water. When she got to an angle of about 60 degrees, there was a sullen sort of rumbling roar, as her massive boilers all left their beds and went crashing down through the bulk's heads and everything that stood in their way. Up to that moment, she had stood out as clear with her rows of electric lights all burning. When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly, she reared up on end, till at last she was absolutely perpendicular. Then, quite quietly, but quicker and quicker, she seemed just to slide away under the surface and disappear. As she vanished, everyone round me on the upturned boat, as though they could hardly believe it, just said, "She's gone." Some little time later, I found that the senior wireless operator was standing just behind me, and from the wireless messages he told me he'd received from different ships, I figured up in my mind that the Cunard liner, Carpathia, one that he said was coming to our rescue, should be up about daylight. It was then I first heard of the Masaba message, and when I said I didn't remember it, he told me he'd put it under a paperweight at his elbow and never sent it to the bridge. Many died from cold during the night, the wireless operator amongst them. And a mighty long time it seemed before daylight broke, standing wet through and up to our knees in icy water on that upturned boat. Frankly, I don't think many of us expected to see daylight. At one time during the night, someone suggested we should say, "Our Father," and I don't think it was exactly scare that made everyone join in. But you'd need to be in somewhat the same fix, where a couple of minutes may mean all the difference between, well, here and hereafter, to understand the feeling we put into it. I've heard that prayer ever since I was the height of 6 penitent coppers, but never with such intense earnestness as the surroundings lent to it that night. However, when daylight did break, most of us were still heads up, and we of the upturned boat transferred to one of the lifeboats. At full daylight, there was the Carpathia steaming toward us. I needn't say just what sort of a welcome sight it was either. Cruising slowly round, she collected the boats one by one. Mine, I know, was loaded down to the gunwales, and no easy job to keep afloat in the rising sea. At last, everyone was safely on board, and with the 700-odd survivors of that night, she turned away from that tragic spot and headed for New York.
Commander Lightoller of the RMS Titanic recorded in the BBC studios in 1936 in the course of a series of broadcasts called "I Was There." In a similar vein, in the 1960s, another of the Titanic's officers, the fourth officer, Joseph Boxhall, I think the last surviving officer of the Titanic's staff, recorded his recollections of the sinking. October 1962.
I went on watch at 8 o'clock on that Sunday night, the 14th of April, along with Moody, who was the 6th officer, and we went on the bridge with Mr. Murdoch, the 1st officer. It was a clear night. There was no signs of any fog. A set of stars was handed over to me that Lightoller had taken in the second dog watch. When I got these stars, I said, now, Moody, you go around the decks and come back at 9 o'clock. I don't know whether the captain came up before 9 o'clock or after 9 o'clock, but anyway, I didn't leave the bridge until after 10 o'clock, having worked the stars out, and when the captain came up, I showed him the position on the chart. She was just over 20 miles ahead of the dead reckoning. And at 10 o'clock, I told Moody to take over the bridge, and I reported to the 1st officer that I was going round the decks. It was a customary thing. At the time when the iceberg was reported from the crow's nest, when they struck the bells, I was sitting in my cabin having a cup of tea.
And I should interrupt there to say that this is the Titanic's 4th officer, Joseph Boxhall, recalling the sinking in the early 1960s, and you're listening to the regular Saturday night test transmission by VK3 Alpha Mike Lima. If you're interested to look in on this transmission, or if you have problems with receiving us clearly, we are streaming concurrently on internet, on YouTube Live. Put into your Google search engine VK3AML 8th May 2021. That's VK3AML 8 May 2021, 8 and 2021 in figures. So for anybody more than 100 miles from Melbourne or with reception problems, that may be the way to go. It's 10 p.m. This is VK3AML going back to the test transmission, and this is Joseph Boxhall of the RMS Titanic recalling the sinking.
And immediately got up and walked along to the bridge, about 60 feet away on the same deck. I was about halfway between the officers' quarters, the entrance to the officers' quarters and the bridge, when the crash came. And it didn't break my step. She was doing full speed, and it didn't break my step. And I got to the bridge, and the captain had evidently arrived about the same moment. And I heard him say to Murdoch, what's the matter? What have you stuck? He said, we've stuck an iceberg, sir. He said, I'm going full speed astern, sir, on the port engine. He swung her head round towards port, and she was on the swing, and that's why she was torn underneath. She was penetrated in 6 compartments. Well, whilst the captain was talking to Murdoch at the starboard wing of the bridge, I slipped down to go forward and have a look to see if I could find any damage. Nobody told me to go. You had to go down about 4 bridge ladders, you see. And I went forward to the entrance to the 3rd class. These 3rd class passengers, Southern European people, were streaming up on deck. And I went down below. I think it was 2 decks down, as low as I could go without removing any hatches or anything. I went down to the 3rd class, crossed over to the starboard side, and I walked along there and looked in the cross passages. I couldn't hear any noise. I couldn't see any damage. And I eventually came up on deck again. As I was emerging on the deck, some of these men were on their way back again to their beds. And there was one man had a piece of ice, and I took it away out of his hands, wondering where he got it from. And I spoke to him in English and tried to make him understand that it was nothing, there was nothing the matter. Go down and go to bed and go to sleep again, you see. And I took this piece of ice and walked along the upper deck on the starboard side to see where the ice came from. And there, just inside of the ship's rail, there was a powdering of ice running along as though she'd compressed it. There was no wind, you see, and it would fall inboard. I came up onto the bridge again and reported to the captain, I've been down below, sir, right down as far as I could go without removing hatches or tarpaulins or anything, right through the third-class accommodation forward. And I don't see any signs of any damage, not even a glass port broken. He said, did you see the carpenter anywhere, Mr. Boxall? I said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I do wish you would go down and find him and tell him to sound the ship round for and let me know right away. Well, I didn't get down all the ladders down to the foredeck. I met the carpenter coming up, absolutely out of breath, and he said, Mr. Boxall, he said, the forepeak hatch is blown off and number 1 tarpaulin is ballooning up. He said, she's evidently making water fast. So I said, all right, go along, carpenter. The captain is on the starboard wing of the bridge and tell the captain. I didn't get down to the foredeck because I met a mail clerk coming up. And he said, Mr. Boxall, the mail room's filling. So I said, oh, carry on and you'll find the captain on the starboard wing of the bridge and report to him. I said, I'll go down there and have a look. So I continued on my way down to the mail room. I tried to go into the first class entrance from that lower deck, from the foredeck. But they'd got the watertight door closed. I had to come up all these ladders and go up over the promenade deck and then down through the main saloon entrance, where I found the band was beginning to tune up. And I got my way down to the mail room and I got down as far as the sorting room. And all the mail clerks were there pulling letters out of the racks. And I was standing on the top of a companionway from the sorting room down to the handing room. And I saw a bag floating by. I instinctively stooped down to try and pick it up. I just couldn't reach it. I realized then that it was serious. So I started to come back again. When I got to the first-class passenger accommodation, I met one of the assistant stewards. And he said, Mr. Boxall, shall I send some men down there? I said, I think you'd better not. I'll go up and report this to the bridge and we'll send down and let you know. As I came up through the top lounge where the band was, they were playing Alexandra's Ragtime Band. And I got back to the boat deck and saw the captain. And I told him, I said, the mail room's filling, sir. Should I send a distress signal? And the captain said, I've already sent a distress signal. What position did you send it from? He said, from the 8 o'clock DR. Well, I said, she was about 20 miles ahead of that, sir. If you like, I will run the position up from the star position up to the time of the contact with the iceberg. And because I said she was about 20 miles ahead of her position, amended this position and took it on to the wireless room. And Phillips, the wireless operator, was bending over his instrument, the telephone, holding the telephone. He says, I'm in contact with the Carpathia. Well, I put the amended position down on the desk and I said, now send that amended position. Do you understand? He said, yes. Well, I said, send that off right away. And that was the position that the Carpathia came to. And I worked on the boat covers, taking off the boat covers on the boat deck, when I heard the crow's nest report a light on the starboard bow. Well, I went on the bridge right away. I found this light with my own glasses, but I wanted the telescope to define what it was, and I realized then that it was 2 mast headlights of a steamer below the horizon. and the lights were very close, and I went back and told the captain, there's a steamer in sight, very nearly ahead, but slightly on the starboard bow. And if she continues on her course, she'll pass close to us down the port side. Oh, I asked the captain, shall I send up some distress rockets? Then we started sending off these distress rockets, the quartermaster and I on the bridge. But I never knew how many I had fired. I knew very well that there was some in the box. The box holds a dozen, and when I told the captain, I said, there are still some in there, sir, but I don't know how many I fired. I didn't see any reply. Some of the passengers that was on the bridge said that they did see a reply. We also called up the ship as she drew closer with a Morse lamp, a very powerful Morse lamp that we had. And eventually, this steamer approached and approached until you could see all her lights with a naked eye. And I should say that she must have been within 5 miles off. You could not only see her lights with a naked eye, but you could see the lights in her portholes. So I reckon that she must have been within 5 miles. And then eventually she turned away and showed a stern light. And about that time, the captain came across the bridge and said, Mr. Boxall, you go away in that boat, pointing to the port emergency boat number 2. And he said, hurry up, Mr. Wilde is waiting to lower it. So I said, you see that white light over there? So pointing it out to him, he said, yes. I said, that is the stern light of that ship. I tumbled into this boat. They'd started to lower her. I tumbled into this lifeboat and we got lowered down. I found that I only had 3 of the ship's crew, a steward, a cook, and a sailor. She had been lowered very slowly. She wouldn't run until you helped the falls, and eventually became waterborne. I tried to count the passengers, but it was difficult as they didn't speak English, you see. And I reckon that I had between 30, around about 30 on board the boat. And the captain looked over the side from the bridge and sung out and told me to go round to the starboard side, to the gangway doors, which was practically the opposite side to where I was lowered. I had great difficulty in getting the boat round there. There was suction. I was using the stroke oar, standing up, and there was a lady helping. She was steering the boat round the ship's stern. When I passed round the boat, to try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them. But when I did eventually reach there, I found that there was such a mob standing in the gangway doors. Really, I daren't go alongside because if they'd jumped, they would have swamped the boat. She was only a small boat, would hold about 35 people. No buoyancy tanks in her at all. Boat that was always turned out, ready for emergency purposes like man overboard. However, I decided that it was not, that I daren't go alongside again. And I pulled off and laid off until I pulled away about a quarter of a mile, I suppose. And I couldn't, what struck me as being strange, that all the other boats, I couldn't see one of them. Long before I left the bridge, a telephone message had come through from the first officer who was aft. He'd been lowering all the starboard boats, and he'd told the quartermaster aft to report to the bridge that all the starboard boats had gone. That's a long time before I left the ship. Well, those boats must have pulled around to the port side, which was really the south side. And I was on the starboard side, on the north side of the ship, all alone.
I'll interrupt there just to say this is VK3AML on 2 metres NBFM ham radio, and also on internet streaming on YouTube Live. If anybody wants to look in on this or is having trouble with reception via ham radio through the distance that they have from Melbourne, or perhaps they're in a valley where they don't get good VHF coverage, try Googling VK3AML 8 May 2021 and you'll get us. And hello to Christine. Good heavens, it has been a long time. Back to the program material, which is 4th Officer Joseph Boxall of the RMS Titanic.
I couldn't see a boat anywhere. That is when I burnt the green light to try and attract the other boats, but I never found them. The sea was perfectly smooth when we left the ship. Every star in the heavens was visible, but there was no moon. So it was dark. And, well, everything was very peaceful, no wind, and no moon, stars, smooth water, until after about an hour the wind got up and there was a little sea. For a long time we didn't move the boat when we laid off on the starboard side. You could see by the arrangements of the lights, all the lights were burning, and you could see that she was going down. You could see that her stern was getting pretty low in the water. She was certainly going down. There was no doubt about it then. And, well, we got away clear of the ship, and we just laid on the oars until eventually they realized that she'd gone, and we heard all the screams. We couldn't do anything. And the screams went on for some considerable time. I can't remember the time when she sank, but it was in the early hours. I didn't see any ice whilst I was in the boat, but I could hear there was a little breeze sprang up before we got to the Carpathia, and I could hear the water on the ice, field ice or whatever it was. But I never saw any ice until after we'd been picked up by the Carpathia. Eventually, we saw a rocket go up, and it turned out to be the Carpathia. So she'd seen my green light that I'd burnt. So I burnt another one. And eventually, she steered for the position that I was in. And consequently, I was the first boat picked up. People on the Carpathia told me that it was about just before 4 o'clock, about 5 minutes to 4, I think. I got alongside there. Everything was ready. Derricks was hoisted. Derrick falls had bowlines in them, and there was ladders over the side. Absolutely everything had been done that was possible to be done. And the captain kept sending down to know if there was an officer in the boat and send him up at once. But I sent a message back, when I get the boat empty, then I'll come up. I've only got one sailor in the boat. And eventually the boat emptied, and then I went up to the Captain Rostron on the bridge. And he said, where's the ship? I said, she's sunk. And I said, I don't know where the other boats are. I've not seen any of them. But they'll be all to the southward of us somewhere. And it was daylight eventually before any boats were sighted. And it was nearly 8 o'clock, I think. As near as I can remember, it was certainly broad daylight when we picked up the other boats. We cruised around in the Carpathia then. And eventually picked up all the other boats. And some of them were hoisted and left in their davits, and some were turned in and put on the deck. We steamed over the ground in the daylight. The Californian, she appeared. I don't remember seeing any other ships. The captain was going to put his officers on watch and watch. So we Titanic officers, the juniors, that was Moody and Pittman and I, we went on watches. We took soundings because we got fog all the way into New York.
Joseph Boxhall, the fourth officer of RMS Titanic, recalling the day in April 1912 when the ship went down and they were rescued via RMS Carpathia. What this first-hand account really alerted me to was the reach into history that audio recordings have, and I, just as a matter of interest, went through the holdings of BBC archives to see how far back into history first-hand accounts stretched. I found a recording of a broadcast from 1940 from a man who was then 95 years old, recalling one of the first significant events of his life, and that was attending the funeral of the Duke of Wellington in 1852, when he would have been about 5 years old. Pardon these pregnant pauses. I've probably put too much onto this to make it easy to find on my list here. But if I can just find the... here we are. A man named Frederick Mead. And this is about as far back as oral histories can go, the middle of the 19th century. Let's take you back to 1940, and this is an incredibly vivid account of the funeral of the Duke, who probably turned around the Battle of Waterloo and finally put a stop to the ambitions of Napoleon.
From the death of Wellington, Queen Victoria proclaimed that he was the greatest man the country ever produced. He died on the 14th September 1852. An embalming must have taken place, for the funeral was long deferred. The body was removed from Walmer Castle on the 11th of November to Chelsea Hospital, that in its hall there might be the lying in state. I lived in Chelsea at the time, so that local interest was added to the excitement. I remember being shocked to learn that 5 persons were crushed to death at the gates of the hospital. Owing to the enormous crowd, described at the time as follows. The actual words were, "The multitude actually smoked like a heated haystack from the pressure and strain upon individuals." To view the funeral procession, seats had been secured in a shop in Fleet Street, where the law courts now stand, a few doors west of Temple Bar, which was decorated, as I thought, very beautifully. My parents seemed to have been affected by that feverish anxiety as to reaching the ceremonial in time. The result being that on the vital morning of the 18th of November, I was aroused from my bed by candlelight. The gas was not laid on until some years after. To reach Fleet Street, we adopted our usual means of locomotion to the city, by steamboat from the Cadogan Pier, disembarking at the Temple. Contrary to expectation, there was no crowd, so that we made the voyage in comfort. There is no doubt that in its impressive and elaborate pageantry, the funeral of the Duke of Wellington would vie with any which has taken place before or since. It was attended by royalty in the person of Prince Albert and by distinguished persons, both English and foreign. Naturally, the impression which such spectacular splendor made upon my mind has passed away, but the appearance of the funeral car, so appropriately caparisoned, with a hero's hat and sword on the coffin, gave me great delight. It was drawn by 12 horses and weighed 12 tons. What necessity there was for so heavy an equipage, it is difficult to understand. After the lamentable loss of life at the lying in state, the police were keen to avoid a similar calamity. As if eager to follow the procession, an enormous crowd appeared on the south side of St. Clement's Danes Church. There was no embankment in those days, and possibly it was feared that as there was no outlet, the crowd would be congested at the bottleneck Temple Bar. I remember that the police closed up across the road and belabored the crowd with their truncheons. The result being that under the warmth of this reception, it soon melted away.
Frederick Mead, recalling in one of the oldest oral history recordings his actual participation as a child looking in on the funeral of the Duke of Wellington in 1852. Moving forward a little bit to other first-hand accounts, a rather more vivid account of a more dramatic event is a 1933 vintage radio recording, a very early radio recording in incredibly good condition, I might add, of a first-hand eyewitness account of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, 1865, a little bit closer to the present, but not much closer. This was given by an actor who in 1865 had been a newsboy at the theatre at which Lincoln was assassinated. And you're listening to VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on 147.475 VHF NBFM, 2 meters, as well as on YouTube Live if you want to look in. Not that you'll see anything much more than a somewhat decayed 67-year-old sitting at a bench with a bit of radio gear in the background and a lot of mess. But if you're having trouble with the reception on NBFM, give the internet stream a try, please. An eyewitness account of the assassination of President Lincoln by Edwin Booth.
Joseph H. Hazelton, veteran actor, now in his 80th year, who was program boy at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. when President Lincoln was assassinated and witnessed the actual shooting, will give his vivid description of that tragic event. Presenting Joseph H. Hazelton.
On the 14th of April, 1865, a little schoolboy, with his books in a strap thrown carelessly across his shoulder, romped down 10th Street in Washington, D.C. And as he approached old Ford's Theater, they stood in front a tall, stately man, swarthy of complexion, raven black curly hair, a drooping mustache, and a wondrous kind eye. That man was John Wilkes Booth, who, for the act of a madman, that night swayed the destiny of our nation. The little schoolboy was myself. It was a wonderful thing for my little companions and myself to speak to Booth or have him speak to us. We looked up to him as something beyond the ordinary, And as I started to pass, I touched my cap, said, "How do you do, Mr. Booth?" With a smile, he beckoned me over to him, lifted my cap from my head, ran his fingers through my hair, said, "Well, little man, you're going to be an actor someday?" I replied, "I don't know, Mr. Booth. Maybe." I was program boy in the house at the time. In fact, errand boy. Little did I dream then that I would spend 60 years of my life in the theatrical profession, which I have. Booth went down in his pocket and he took out a little folder that contained the script, coin of the day, commonly known as shin plasters. Taking off a 10-cent shin plaster, he pressed it into my hand, pulled my cap playfully down over my eyes, patted me on the shoulder, bade me go buy myself something. I've often wondered in the many intervening years whether that man had the terrible crime of that night on his mind when speaking to an innocent little schoolboy. Well, as was my custom, at night I went around the theater to hand out the programs. It was a gala night. The play was Our American Cousin. Laura Keene was the star. It was her benefit night. Everyone knew the president would be there. The paper had spoken of it throughout the week. The house was packed from pit to dome. The gold lace of the Army and Navy predominating to some extent. The president and his party came late. The second act was on. In the party was Mr. Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln, Surgeon General Barnes, and Miss Harris, daughter of Senator Harris. And as the party entered the theater, the orchestra played Hail to the Chief. The audience rose en masse and cheered. President Lincoln came down to the edge of the box, and with that sad, sweet smile that he was wont to wear on such occasions, bowed his acknowledgments, and the play went on. I was standing looking directly up at the president's box, smiling when he smiled, all enraptured with that wonderful face. He was an idol to me. I happened to turn my eyes to the right, to the main entrance. I saw Wilkes Booth enter. He spoke to Mr. Buckingham, the doorkeeper, for a few moments. I marveled at the change in his costume. When he spoke to me in the afternoon, he was faultlessly dressed in the picturesque costume of the day, velvet collar and cuffs, ruffled shirt. Now he had on heavy cavalry boots, spurs, blue army shirt, and a slouched army hat. As he went up the steps to the right, towards the dress circle, and then towards the president's box, I wondered in my childish way what he could be doing there in such a garb on such an auspicious occasion. I didn't have long to wait. There was a flash and a report. President Lincoln had been assassinated. There are not words enough in the vocabulary of the English language to describe the awful hush fell over that house when the shot was fired. Everyone seemed to realize that something terrible had happened, but no one seemed to take the initiative. Till Laura Keene, coming from her dressing room, ran down to the edge of the stage and cried out, "Ladies and gentlemen, the president's been shot by John Wilkes Booth." Then all was pandemonium. When Booth fired the shot from a single-barreled weapon, commonly known as a derringer, he dropped the weapon and drew a knife. Surgeon General Barnes attempted to stop him and received an ugly gash in the arm. Booth got to the edge of the box, leaped over. As he did so, his spur caught in the flag that draped the box. He tripped and fell to the stage. Now, history says he broke his leg. Such is not the case. Had Booth have broken his leg, he never in the world could have gotten across that 60 foot of stage. However, he did fracture the small bones in his foot. I shall never forget to my dying day the look of anguish and despair on that man's face as he half dragged and half limped to the center of the stage, with a wild, maniacal stare, brandished the knife above his head, and cried out, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Thus perished tyrants. He managed to get out to the stage entrance, mounted his horse, and drove away. At Eastern Branch, he was joined by young Harold, the youngest of the conspirators, and also by a third party, which history does not record. They managed to get to Port Tobacco, where Dr. Mudd set the small bones in Booth's foot. Then the three got a boat and went across the Potomac. When they got on the other side, they found an old colored man driving a wagon. It was raining, and was covered, the furniture in the wagon was covered with tarpaulin. They paid this old colored man to drive them to the Rappahannock ferry, a flatboat ferry. They got across the Rappahannock River and went up to the home of Mr. Garrett, Charles Garrett in Rappahannock County. There they asked for shelter. They could not get into the house, but Mr. Garrett told them they might be sheltered in the barn. Understand, it was a tobacco barn, not a hay barn. When Booth got into this barn, he discovered that he'd dropped some papers in getting out of the wagon, and he sent his third man, Rudy, back to get them. When Rudy was gone, Booth said to young Harold, "There's no use of us sticking together. We'll be caught. I'm going to escape and get to Norfolk. Make a trip to South America if I can get a ship," which he did. He came back to America 3 years afterwards, and from pillar to post, he butted through the country, always seemingly well supplied with money. 1903, a man by the name of St. Helen, who really was Booth, as has since been proved, committed suicide by taking 16 grains of arsenic, enough to kill a regiment, in fact. And on his deathbed, he confessed that he was Booth to a priest and to a number of the citizens in the town, one of whom I've talked to since then. I understand that his own sister, when this question was mooted in 1903, made an affidavit that her brother came back when he said he did 3 years after the assassination, and stayed 10 days at her home in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. So it's a pretty well satisfied fact to the government that they did not get Booth, that he was not shot by Boston Corbett. But we'll leave Booth and we'll go back to the theater. They lifted the president tenderly up again, took him across to the home of Mr. Peterson, one of our merchants. Mr. Peterson had a small house and a large family, and the only available space was a little hall bedroom in the rear, almost under the steps that led to the second floor. But was any port in a storm. They took the president in, put him tenderly to bed, sent for his family, his private physician, Dr. Stone, and the vigil of the night wore on. Gray dawn was just streaking through the windows of that little home on 10th Street on the morning of the 15th of April, when Dr. Stone, holding the president's hand and feeling the pulse, that lifeblood that was fast ebbing away, said to Secretary Edward M. Stanton, who stood with tear-stained cheeks at the foot of the bed, "Mr. Secretary, what is the time?" Secretary Stanton, taking out his watch, replied, 22 minutes past 7. Then Dr. Stone, placing the president's hand gently across his breast, sighed out, "President is dead." Then Secretary Stanton uttered that famous remark that'll go thundering down through the corridors of time, "Now he belongs to the ages." And when the spirit of that mighty man sawed its way to that bourne from which no traveler returns, it served to weld a link of steel between the North and the South, making it one grand and beautiful nation that stood in 65 as it stands today, with outstretched arms to welcome the oppressed from other shores to come and build their homes here in free America. But it also stands today as it stood in 65 when our martyred president met his doom, ready at all hazards, by force of arms if necessary, to protect its honor, its integrity, and its flag, the flag of the greatest nation on earth, the United States of America.
Mr. Hazelton has an attractive leaflet made of this address with a portrait of himself and personally autographed, and would be pleased to mail a copy to anyone desiring it if you will send your address and any small contribution to cover the actual cost of production and postage. Address, Joseph H. Hazelton, 5353 Virginia Avenue, Hollywood, California. Or address Mr. Hazelton to the station to which you are now listening.
And please do not address your request to VK3AML in East Berwick because Mr. Hazelton hasn't been around for the last 86 years. This is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima on 147.475 and on YouTube streaming live. If you care to Google VK3AML, which is the call sign of this ham radio station, 8 May 2021, you'll probably find this stream. So far, we've been listening to recordings of people recalling historical events. With the late 1800s, we get to the point where it was possible to record significant historical events as they happened. And this brings us to some of the oldest recordings I've ever had the pleasure of taking a hand in the restoration of. Edison had an English agent named Colonel George Edward Gouraud. Gouraud was a Civil War veteran, fought in the Union Army. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, the equivalent of the English and Australian Victoria Cross, so had quite a public profile socially. But in the late 1880s, while Edison was inventing various devices for electric light and in other major manufacturing areas, he was gradually metamorphosing from inventor status into a major manufacturer based in New Jersey by that time. He took up his old idea of recording sound that he'd pioneered in 1877, but improved it so that the recordings were of higher quality and could be removed from the machine for permanent storage. And by golly, some of them have been kept in permanent storage for 133 years. And that's the nature of the recording you're about to hear. In 1888, having invented an improved phonograph using wax for the cylinder material, he sent a prototype of this phonograph to his London agent, Colonel Gouraud, who had a home at Beulah Hill in North London, which he called Little Menlo after Edison's Menlo Park laboratory. It was electrically lit by, needless to say, an Edison lighting plant. And in an effort to popularize sound recording, Gouraud invited all sorts of famous people to soirees, to evenings where he would put up the food and the wine and record these famous people. And one complete set of cylinders survives from a session recorded on the 5th of October 1888 of stunning quality, mainly because they were forgotten at the Edison National Historic Site in West Orange, New Jersey, for the better part of 90 years after Edison died. You'll hear Colonel Gouraud, a rather pompous gentleman, by that time wearing a fez, smoking cigars to excess, and with a very well-equipped wine cellar with which he would loosen the tongues of various famous people to speak into the phonograph. As a consequence of which, on this evening, recorded so nicely. You will hear the voices of the musician Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, Cecil Raikes, as he introduces him, Her Majesty's Postmaster General of that time, 1888. And perhaps most significant of all, the editor, this really does go back in time, the editor Edmund Yates, who worked with Charles Dickens on several of his books. Edmund Yates was born in 1831 and worked with Charles Dickens towards the end of Dickens' life. Edmund Yates died in 1894. You'll hear him as well. So I'll cue each of the cylinders in turn. Each runs about 3 minutes, but there are about 8 of them. And they have a degree of continuity through them. So I'll leave the rest of the announcing to Edison's London agent, Colonel Gouraud, and I will take you, at least in sound, back to the 5th of October, 1888.
My lords and gentlemen, pray silence for our host, Colonel Gouraud. My lords and gentlemen, I confess to some embarrassment upon this occasion, speaking as I do for the first time in public and in the presence of so distinguished a company. I feel greatly honored by your presence here tonight. A company distinctly representative in its character. Her Majesty's Postmaster General, Mr. Cecil Raikes, is here to speak not only for politics in its highest sense, but for that great department over which he so worthily presides, and to whose administrative ability we confidently look for the means of sending innocent phonograms from point to point throughout the world without their being opened or root or being otherwise tampered with by over-inquisitive officials. There is in the association with the name of the Postmaster General, the name of Mr. Edmund Yates, a peculiar fitness, he having served with distinction for no less than a quarter of a century in the same important department of the public service. In welcoming Mr. Yates at Little Menlo, my English home, for the first time, I feel that I am meeting an old friend, for it was my pleasure and my honor to be one of that vast army of Americans who welcomed him in America now some 20 years ago. Nobody can better answer than Mr. Yates for literature. And who better could answer for music than that distinguished composer, Sir Arthur Sullivan, and to whom the phonograph takes this earliest opportunity of expressing its delight at the great success achieved but a few nights since by that distinguished composer's latest production, The Yeoman of the Guard. Mr. J.C. Parkinson's interest of many years since and his identification with the Atlantic cable make a fit beginning to so appropriate and interesting an end so far as we have gone, as is presented by this latest achievement in connection with it. Mr. Tooker, and I thank you very sincerely for the cordial manner in which you have received the toast just proposed, and for the very kindly expression with which it was accompanied by its proposer. But I confess that in my reply, I am thinking rather of another than of myself. I am thinking of him, that great genius, in whose real honor we have met here tonight, and of whom I am but a feeble shadow in Europe. I am but expressing aloud what I feel must be in the mind of each of you when I say how much I regret that he cannot be here in the flesh as well as he is in the spirit, and as you will presently see in the voice. I thank you in the name of Mr. Edison first, and then for myself. And in conclusion, I would say that I sincerely trust that this will be but the beginning of many more interesting meetings under similar interesting circumstances. And with your permission, I should like to take this occasion to express my thanks to Mr. Hamilton and his assistants for their able cooperation in preparation of the interesting matter with which we have been entertained and are yet to be. I will now only ask you to drink to the health of Edison. Standing, bumpers, and cheers. Those cheers and any kind words which any of you may like to say to Mr. Edison in response to this toast will be recorded on another instrument in the adjoining room and will be sent to America through the kind agency of Her Majesty. Little Menlo, October the 5th, 1888. Phonogram, Guru to Edison. Dear Edison, I propose to conclude a most interesting and agreeable evening, so far as I am concerned, by introducing to you the few friends who have honored me this evening by their presence here. Each of them has expressed a desire to say a few words to you, and I am sure you will be glad to hear their voices, as I am glad to be the medium of communicating them to you. Need I say, through your marvelous phonograph. First, the Right Honorable Cecil Rakes, Her Majesty's Postmaster General. Now listen to Mr. Rakes' voice. We thank you for a most interesting and delightful evening. We feel that you are to become inventor of a new magic. We regard this invention as destined almost to revolutionize the means of human communication. And we wish you all success in promoting a discovery which cannot fail to have the most beneficial results for the whole community of nations. Cecil Rakes, Her Majesty's Postmaster General. I next have the pleasure of introducing to you a name that is as familiar to you and all of our countrymen as it is, I am happy to say, to myself and my family. Mr. Edmund Yates. This is the record of a most marvelous dinner, transmitted to you by your most marvelous invention. If I lack words to describe the dinner, it is because I am so enwrapped and so enchanted by your invention that I find myself much more stupid than I ought to be after the grand excitement of our friends' meats and wines. Edmund Yates, not Her Majesty's Postmaster General, but one who was a poor clerk under Her Majesty's Postmaster General for 25 years. We will now pass on to the next phonogram, which will begin with a record that I am sure you will receive with infinite delight. Knowing your love for music, I need only say that the record will be the voice of the great composer Sir Arthur Sullivan, whose music is as well known in America as it is in England, and as well loved by those who know it. Little Menlo, October 5th, 1888, from Guru to Edison. Continuation of introduction of Twain. Now listen to the voice of Sir Arthur Sullivan. Dear Mr. Edison, if my friend Edmund Yates has been a little incoherent, it is in consequence of the excellent dinner, good wine that he has drunk. Therefore, I beg you will excuse him. He has his lucid intervals. For myself, I can only say that I am astonished and somewhat terrified at the result of this evening's experiment. Astonished at the wonderful powers you have developed, and terrified at the thought that so much hideous, bad music may be put on record forever. But all the same, I think it is the most wonderful thing that I have ever experienced, and I congratulate you with all my heart on this wonderful discovery. Arthur Sullivan. My next introduction is Mr. Broadley, well-known English barrister, whose name will always be remembered by his distinguished defense of Arabi Pasha. Now listen to his voice. It would be difficult for me to convey to Mr. Edison. Dear Mr. Edison, it would be very difficult for me to convey to you any idea of the impression which your invention has caused tonight upon the guests who assembled round the hospitable table at Colonel Guru. The mysteries of the East and the mysteries of Egypt fail before an invention which is doubtless destined to effect a revolution in the means of communication throughout the civilized world. I trust that one of the first outcomes of the dinner today will be a safer transmission of your phonographic records to their destination. As I am speaking to you, the Postmaster General is holding a serious consultation with Colonel Guru upon the subject of the transmission of these records. There is one other subject to which I think these phonographs may be very judiciously applied, and that is as a substitute for the great plethora of after-dinner speaking from which we to some extent suffer in this country. I have had the privilege tonight of officiating as phonographic toastmaster, and when this instrument is introduced for that purpose, I shall claim to be the ancestor of a long line of toastmasters who, instead of discharging their functions in the present manner, have recourse to the phonograph for the expeditious fulfillment of those duties with which in this country we are sufficiently familiar. I can only express my great thanks to Colonel Guru for giving us the opportunity of witnessing your invention, and express an earnest hope that in the near future we may have again an opportunity of witnessing some further experiments with the phonograph. A.M. Broadley, barrister at law. Our next guest, whom I will present to you, is Mr. J.C. Parkinson, whose name you will remember as an old telegraphist yourself, as having an early identification with that most important phase of telegraphy, which now goes by the common name of Atlantic cables. Mr. Parkinson will now speak. It is a great privilege to have taken part this evening in this most interesting celebration. You have heard from our friends previously how deeply we are indebted to our host tonight and to you. I must apologize, Mr. Parkinson, for leaving him so long in connection, and will now relieve him from his embarrassment by passing on to Mr. Augustus Harris, more popularly known as Augustus Drury-Linus. I confess that I had supposed that Mr. Augustus Drury-Linus thought that there remained to him no more worlds to conquer. But there can be no doubt that he has, that in the launching of the Armada, he has eclipsed all of his previous most brilliant efforts. He has my most sincere congratulations, but his triumph will not be complete unless the good ship Armada finally drops her anchors in American waters. Passing from the drama, we find ourselves where we always do in time, vis-a-vis with the law. In our friend Mr. Broadley, we have a distinguished representative whose achievements I have not forgotten in connection with that most interesting event known in history as the defense of Arabi Pasha. I beg his Pasha's pardon. I should have said Arabi Pasha. Our congratulations to Mr. Broadley would be incomplete if we were not to mention his more recent victory in the case of Ismail Pasha, which I hope has been as satisfactory to his pocket as I hear it has been to his science.
And interrupting there, this is VK3AML with a test transmission on 147.475. What you're listening to is the first soiree held by Edison's London agent, Colonel George Gouraud, in demonstrating the then new wax cylinder phonograph to various famous personages, including the Postmaster General Cecil Raikes, the well-known composer Sir Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, and Edmund Yates, who worked as an editor with Charles Dickens earlier in his life. This is recorded, all of these cylinders were recorded on the 5th of October 1888, and when I first heard them, I had more hair, and my hair stood on end as I heard these voices emerge from 130-odd years ago. It's getting close to 11 o'clock. It's got to 11:02, I see. So at about 10 minutes past 11, I'll open it up for discussion on the amateur band, if anybody would care to come back to us on 147.475. In the meantime, another recording which turned up in the same box of records from 1888 among Colonel Gouraud's collection was a musical recording of Sir Arthur Sullivan's well-known composition, The Lost Chord, and it's played as a piano duet with a trumpet. The trumpet, I know, was played by Colonel Guro's son. We have photographs from 1888 showing that. The piano, however, the theory is that this is actually Sir Arthur Sullivan playing. So, while I don't like to play music too often on ham radio, unless it's of documentary importance, let's have a listen to one of the first musical recordings ever made, also October 1888. Unfortunately, the record runs out just before the music finishes, but that is one of the earliest surviving music recordings of all. Cut at Little Menlo, the house that was maintained by Colonel George Guro, Edison's London agent, and recorded in October 1888. So any deficiencies in that recording, I'm sure you'll take account of. Anyway, with that, it's 11:05 p.m. I might as well throw it open now for discussions on ham radio. I'll just bring a speaker over. As we normally do. I'll get my pen in case we... One of these days, you know, I'm going to be on this thing and there'll be nobody there. That will be embarrassing. I hope it doesn't happen this time. So this is VK3 Alpha Mike Lima calling CQ on 147.475, standing by for any calls.
3ACZ.
Yeah, hi Peter. It was great to see you at the Hamfest today at Moorabbin. And boy, what an example that was of people that had been shut in for a better part of a year suddenly having the door flung open and associating en masse. VK3ACZ, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML from VK3ACZ. Good evening, Chris, and good morning to other... good morning. Good evening to other... it's been a long day. To other listeners. Yeah, I'll start with the business end about the broadcast, of course. Haunting, chilling. Again, I would describe the two interviews, personal statements about the Titanic from people that were there, albeit one was something almost 50 years later. Not that I think for a moment that sort of stuff wouldn't remain very vivid and very fresh in one's psyche and overall memory. It got me back thinking about, as a school kid, I think I might have mentioned last week, reading Walter Lord's wonderful book, A Night to Remember, 1950s, 1953, 55, something like that. Great historian he was, lawyer by profession, I believe. But what I needed to grasp from that is what was mentioned in the broadcast, not being able to comprehend why the California sat there and ignored the rockets. It's quite easy to understand why they ignored the Morse signals, because the radio operator had hit the sack. But yeah, I need to read that book again to find out if there was an explanation as to why the California did ignore it. But just ghastly when you think that help was at hand. And the first of the two interviewees said that, didn't he, at one point or other? Yeah, very chilling. All the broadcast was good, but I guess because it's my niche interest area, it was the two Titanic interviews that really blew me away. And thank you for sharing them. Yeah, anyway, that's enough for one over. I'll put it back to you, and hopefully there's somebody else on the side as well that would like to weigh in with tonight's terrific broadcast. VK3AML from VK3ACZ.
Pausing for anybody who'd like to come back if they're there. Okay, couldn't hear anybody coming back there, which is a little disappointing. VK3ACZ, VK3AML, and good evening to Bill Rizos, who's watching on the stream. Christine, Dennis, the avid YouTube watcher, John Young. Yeah, it's interesting seeing the numbers on the YouTube stream at the top of the screen and how they vary according to what you play. Generally, at the end of a night, I find that the number of people on the YouTube stream varies from about 6 to 17. But generally, at the end of the night, about 50 people have looked through. Chris A. Marginal at Riddles Creek tonight. Sorry about that. VK3CAE. Yeah, Chris 3CAE has just typed on our YouTube live that he's having trouble hearing us. Riddles Creek really depends on the conditions. If we've got knife edge diffraction, or if something as subtle as foliage being wet can do it. And he's saying it's my fault, not yours. So presumably there's some sort of an antenna problem there. The Californian, yeah. One thing I found researching that recording by Lightoller and the other one by Boxall was that both of them criticised the lack of radio communication with closer ships that could have come to their rescue faster, because a lot of people died with the Titanic from exposure from cold in the water, which was literally ice cold. And the surviving radio operator, not Jack Phillips, who went down with the ship, but the other one, took exception to that, and there was some legal trouble over that after the broadcast, 1936. I believe that Lightoller also did a book of his experiences because, as he said at the start of that broadcast, he'd been in about 4 sinkings in his career. So you can be very unlucky. Lightning does strike twice in the same place. It was nice to see you today, Peter, and catch up with everybody. I certainly had a very social time at Moorabbin Town Hall, and that was one of the best attended hamfests I think I've ever been to. I only picked up about $10 worth of stuff. All I needed was connectors. I have my collecting habit well under control now. Having a wife who is the greatest chucker out in the world to contradict the hoarding tendency that I have has been a marvellous system of checks and balances. But I specifically did seek out those two Titanic interviews as a result of your feedback last week. VK3ACZ, with a pause for anybody else who'd like to break in. VK3AML.
VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Acknowledging VK3ECG. I'll hand it over to ACZ first, and then around to you, 3ECG. VK3ACZ to take, and then hand around. VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML in the group, also acknowledging 3ECG from VK3ACZ. Yes, the Hamfest was really good value, being a relatively new ham, 8 months old now. It was my first Hamfest. There could have been a couple more of them, but for COVID, but we don't need to go there. Very interested in walking around and listening to voices, because I didn't know too many faces, but hearing the voices, being able to say, oh, yes, I know that, that's such and such a call sign. I was quite pleased with myself. I did that a few times, and to put faces to the voices and or the call signs was good too. Mind you, the only disappointment for me, and it's not really a disappointment because I came away with a bit of a door prize, as you know, but it would have been nice to have my call sign drawn out of the bucket first rather than a bit further down the list, but I was still happy to go away with a prize. That was a special moment as well. But I can say I look forward to going to more of them, and obviously they're a great thing for us fellow amateurs to get together and have these social occasions. And especially good to finally stand face-to-face in front of Peter Parker and be able to thank him. He was instrumental in my getting started in amateur radio in the middle of the curfew. As I've explained to you, Chris, but I can explain to other listeners. As a prospective ham, there was no chance to go, knock on another amateur's door and say, hey, can you help me with this, that, or whatever, ask questions. It had to be Peter Parker's books, his online material, and his videos. Just a wonderful, wonderful fellow, helping out all hams more than he would possibly know. So it was good to be able to tell him to his face. Good to meet up with Sean 3KK, who runs the round table net on a Wednesday night on 70 centimetres, and all pretty good. Anyway, I should be keeping to the broadcast material, I suppose, because your listeners probably don't want to hear waffle about Hamfests. But just one other thing, it was also chilling thinking about President Lincoln's assassination. You really bring up the best material. I know I say that every week, but it's true every week, Chris. And thank you too for, I did express an interest in the Titanic after what you shared about the Carpathia, and it was wonderful to hear what we heard tonight. So thank you again for that. Anyway, back over to you, and you can bring others into the broadcast. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Around to VK3ECG. VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML with VK3ACZ on the side. VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. The name is David. Yes, I enjoyed the Hamfest today as well. It was interesting and so on. I got a chance to catch up with my old friend Steve, VK3SL, of course, and whom I've known for a long, long time. And he taught my daughter to play cello. That was the background there. So we have a very common interest in sort of classical music and things like that. But great to hear the recording, the descriptions of almost that casual way in which the issues of people dying overnight from the hypothermia was just extraordinary, and almost the casual way in which people spoke of that. I think it's very, very telling of how people cope with those things after such a long period of time, and they basically rationalise it, and it becomes part of their life. It's really absolutely fascinating. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML with VK3ACZ on the side, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yeah, David 3ECG. Are you the David that I met at some of Steve's film nights of yore, where he showed Harold Lloyd films?
That's correct, Chris. That's correct.
Okay, gotcha. I know who you are now. Yeah, Steve, great bloke. Very good on survival skills in camping, and I particularly was glad that he was able to come with us to Deal Island in Bass Strait to do that experiment with modulated light communication back in January, because his ability to, particularly with victualling, working out how much we would consume in the way of water and food each day, and accurately predicting what should be taken in the way of dehydrated and canned food for a Remote Island trip as we did. Gosh, I've got hiccups. How embarrassing. So he has skills in all sorts of areas, particularly camping, hiking. He's a lot healthier than I am, but then he's 14 years younger than I am, so it tells. It's a bit embarrassing sometimes when your level of fitness is somewhat compromised by sitting in front of a computer so long, because so much of what we do these days is computer dictated, not just this communication stuff I'm doing at the moment, but writing, audio editing, video editing, everything's through this bloody computer that's sitting in front of me. So this room, I probably see more of this room than I see of any other place on earth, and less of the sun outside. It'll kill me. I've got to take it more seriously. But yeah, Dave, nice to find you there. I knew that you were an amateur, and that Steve and you had some discussions there. And I think I briefly met you in passing at those film nights that Steve used to have. But from what I can see of Steve's life at the moment, and I was given a lift to the Hamfest by Steve today, having 5 children all in their teens, being the chief cook, bottle washer and taxi driver must really take it out of you. I'll hand it back around to VK3ACZ for comment with a pause for anybody else who'd like to break in. VK3ACZ with a pause, VK3AML.
Yeah, nothing heard there. VK3AML and the group from VK3ACZ. And good evening, Dave. Don't think I've had the pleasure. And I like the call sign, electrocardiograph. Hi. As a former nurse, that ECG rings a bell with me. But whether that's deliberate or otherwise, I wholeheartedly approve. Nothing more to add at this moment. I'll just go back to listening on the side. And yeah, hopefully we'll still get some others to come along, but good that you've joined us tonight there, Dave. Back to you, Chris, VK3AML from VK3ACZ.
No worries, Peter. I'm glad that you enjoyed the Titanic material as well. There is more, but it tends to be of a later period, and people that were less directly involved with the control of the situation. More, there are accounts of passengers, but they tend to be, how can I put it, more focused on a personal experience and less focused on what the whole ship was doing. Those earlier recordings from the 1930s particularly, it was fresher in the memory, and I suppose fresher in terms of pain, as it must have been. Yeah, Dave, I hope the material related to Arthur Sullivan was of some interest to you. And interestingly, that it was mentioned that the recording of Arthur Sullivan was done only weeks after the premiere of The Omen of the Guard, which had it not been for the fact that the announcements on the record actually announced the date, the 5th of October 1888, we'd be able to work it out from that. VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf with Peter, VK3ACZ on the side. Yes, it is fascinating, the Sullivan stuff. I mean, and the piece of music I know, I think it's the Lost Chord or whatever. So I remember I've got an old recording of that somewhere. I think it was a Mormon Tabernacle Choir did it or something like that, but it's quite an extraordinary piece. I used to remember the words to it, to the piece, but I'll have to look them up again sometime. But yeah, no, it's a really fascinating piece, and quite typical of its time, and harmonies are very typical of the time as well. Yeah, and yes, I remember the Steve's some of the stuff on YouTube about the island trip, and I also remember Steve in his younger days before he had the 5 children, where he would travel around Australia hiking and would actually go ahead in the car, I think, and bury freeze-dried food or that he'd dried himself, and they would bury it and then have to walk to get to that particular place and dig it up and eat it and so on. But yes, that was, I think it's a little bit more than my hiking trips, mine are more sort of pleasant walks rather than those extensive hikes that he did. Although I'm getting a bit more into walking, actually. It's a great way of keeping fit. But I do know what you mean about the issues around trying to keep in the sunshine and sitting in front of the computer all the time, which I do find myself doing. And even my GP, I think, was saying, you have to take vitamin D and so on, because just not getting enough sunlight. And I suppose that's probably true. But there again, these things can be overplayed. Yes, my call sign is, it wasn't deliberate, but when I arrived in Australia, I still have my old UK call sign, and but when I arrived in Australia, these were one of the 2 I was offered. And being a medical person myself, I thought, well, I couldn't resist the ECG, so I stuck with that, Peter. That's how I've never bothered to go for a 2-letter one, because, I mean, apart from, I suppose I could have chosen something else like MI or something like that, but I'd rather stick with ECG. I think it's more pleasant in the scheme of things. Anyway, yes, I think you're right. I mean, some of those really early descriptions of people who were actually there and how the Titanic issues were managed, and almost that casualness, as if people, that sense of people's disbelief, I suppose, is fascinating. But I'm always intrigued by people who, recall these stories many years later, and how those intervening years have changed their perception, almost certainly from, what must have been a sort of almost PTSD sort of experience at the time or shortly afterwards. And yet, those years later, it has somehow been sort of integrated, and no doubt the story has been retold many times, and they have come to terms with an element of it, which I think it's a fascinating sort of process. Anyway, back to you then, Chris. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf with VK3ACZ on the side.
Waiting to see if anybody comes up. VK3ECG, VK3AML, and just answering people on my Facebook list. Somebody has asked here if most of the listeners on YouTube are from VK3. I do have listeners fairly regularly from Adelaide, a couple from there, 1 or 2 from New South Wales. Dennis is, I think, from Canberra. I'm not quite sure. And over the last few weeks, we seem to have had one call in from Washington, D.C., who must be up at some incredible hour of the morning watching this. So there are quite a few people looking in from around the world. One of the problems with YouTube Live is that they do intelligently compress. They use a codec that compresses the audio fairly heavily. It's passable for speech, but it really hacks music about. And I'm looking for some other platform that is more capable of transmitting audio without so much compression. And the other problem with YouTube is that frequently scanning bots will come across the site and misidentify recordings as copyright material and give me warnings, so that I either have to mute that section of the recording of this video chat. So something like an audio streaming server would be better. I'll have to look into that. But I'm just getting used to the technology. I can't at the moment insert stills or anything of that nature. It's just purely I have the webcam and that's all, and it's streaming at 1080p, so it's taking up a fair bit of bandwidth. And frankly, I just find it more of a disadvantage than an advantage. If I was an attractive young bloke with muscles and lots of hair and, you know, fake tan, and women had their tongue hanging out, it might be different. But I'm 67 years old. And the video component to me is a bit of a pain. It's a pain to see myself. It's got to that stage. But Steve, who's considerably younger than me, even Steve says that he finds the video section of the transmission embarrassing, and more of a, I suppose, more of a hindrance than a help. And what can we show here except for, you know, just an old bloke sitting at a desk? It's not very exciting stuff. The audio is what I'm aiming at. So if you know of any computer platform that can do better with audio, I'd be most interested. Or if anybody on the chat there, I've grabbed the wrong damn mouse. If anybody on the text chat knows of a better streaming service than YouTube Live, I'd be most interested. Interestingly, an old friend of mine from high school days turned up tonight, Christine, who I haven't seen in 51 years. Can you believe that? God, she must be having a shock seeing me now. The last time she saw me, I was 15 years old. So you never can tell. Anyway, I'll hand it back to you, David. What are your particular interests in classical music as a matter of interest? Have you got any particular composers or style of classical music? I have a particular interest in minor English composers of the turn of last century, Edward German, Albert Coates, those sort of people. VK3CG with a gap to see if anybody else breaks in. VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3ECG with the ACZ on the side. Yeah, it is. Yes, I'm not sure about I've got any real advantage on any other sort of video platforms to use. There are a few others that are used, and I've watched some of the other YouTube things that come out of the UK and some of those international ones. A lot of them seem to be sort of unboxing of brand new equipment, of course, and things like that, and they're sort of semi-commercial, I suspect. I've never really played very much. I mean, I've got a few YouTube things that I've done through work and so on and so forth, but most of the things we've obviously, with people using Zoom and Teams and all that sort of stuff these days, but you know, that's not a general accessible thing. You've got to send out the email with the links and so on and so forth, and unless you're paying for it, then you get limited time and so on. There are a few other that of these channels that or systems that people do use this software, but I'm not sure that their audio is any better than the YouTube one would be. I'm not sure if you subscribe to it, you get a better service either. There sometimes if you subscribe, you get a different rate of delivery, but whether that applies to the sort of the broadcast things that you're doing or whatever, I'm not sure. As for the classical music, well, I mean, yes, I mean, I'm probably my interest really actually is quite early music. I'm a singer, so I'm singing with Victoria Chorale, which is really nice. We've got a concert coming up soon. It's very, very nice to do, and we finally managed to get back to our rehearsals, which was lovely. About 6 weeks or so ago, for the first time, as they relaxed the restrictions, and we decided we'd do a fairly something that people knew fairly well, so it wouldn't be a major slog for a concert in a very short space of time. But it also means we can actually have a concert now, which is really lovely. So we're just going to do the 4/8 Requiem, which is everyone knows, and it's a very romantic piece, but it's certainly very nice and well known. So it makes life a little bit easier in rehearsals, running up to the first concert that we'll have for 18 months now. So that's really nice. So choral music, and the other thing that I do is a little bit is some very early music, singing sort of Renaissance and stuff like that. My wife's actually a Renaissance dancer with a Renaissance dance group. So very occasionally, when they're having some performance, I'll come along and either do some narration or do some or some singing and so on with them, which is quite fun to do. So yes, a bit of that sort of out of time issues, but yes, Coates and that English sound, absolutely classic. And there's something about you hear a piece of English music, either from the light sort of music series or around the times of the wars and so on, or even earlier, and there just is something about that English sound that you just, even if you don't know the piece of music, you just know it's an English piece. I don't know what it is about it, but it's absolutely fascinating. Back to you, Chris. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
I wait to see if anybody else pops up, but I don't think they will. Now, I was just listening to see if anybody else would pop up, but I think we've left it probably a little late. The Victoria Chorale, interesting. For a while, I know Rodney Reynolds was doing some recording work for them. He's VK3AAR, but he's not active on ham radio now, as far as I know. And some people that I grew up with, the De Hugard sisters, were singing with them many years ago. And I think Val Pyers, who was a geography teacher at my high school, Camberwell High, Val Pyers, was a director of the Victoria Chorale way back. It may not have been known by that name then. I think I'm talking 50 years ago. I mean, it's a long time. 4/8 Requiem, eh? With regard to Renaissance dance, I wonder if the name Arnold Dolmetsch means anything to you, and the revival of early instruments that he was involved with. Dolmetsch, I think, was almost single-handedly responsible, the Dolmetsch family, in the late 20s for the revival of the playing of early music on early instruments. And interestingly, I was going through the newsreel collection of Movietone News. The negatives, unedited from most of their early 1920s newsreels, are now held by the University of South Carolina and have been put online, but it's rather difficult to work your way through them unless you know what you're doing. But there is a reel and a half, about 15 minutes worth of sound film from 1928 of the Dolmetsch family doing medieval and Renaissance dances in costume and playing things like viol da gamba and serpents. I remember are played in this newsreel as well. I think at the time the musical establishment regarded them as slightly potty. VK3ECG, that's a bit much for one over, but let's see how you respond. VK3ECG, with a pause for any breakers, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML, VK3ECG. Well, yes, absolutely. You're quite right. Valpires did found Victoria Corral. He, of course, had founded Melbourne Corral, and but there was let's say, a schism, and I don't know the full story because I wasn't with Victoria Corral at the time, or Melbourne Corral at the time, and I think sort of half the choir went with him and half the choir stayed on as Melbourne Corral. He formed Victoria Corral, and it was a few years later that I joined in, but he was actually another teacher who had actually formed a small choir at a primary school with parents and my children there, and he got the parents to sing something for some school concert, and he heard me sing, and I'd sung a lot when I was a student and so on, but I had done very little for 10 years since then. And he said, "Oh, do you sing?" And I said, "Oh, I used to years ago." And he said, "Oh, you must come and sing. I'll talk to Valpires about it." So really, that's how it all started. And I was sort of a part-time singer them for a while, and then sang more regularly over the years. But yeah, fascinating. I mean, and the Dolmetsch is interesting. I've got some CDs of recordings. I think of the must be some early recordings of the Dolmetsch family, and they're all sort of standing there in these very vague, interesting sort of costumes on the cover. I'll have to look them out actually. But of course, then they produce the instruments and the Dolmetsch recorders and all that sort of thing. But in my very younger days, I did play some of those instruments. I have actually played a serpent with great difficulty and poor skill, but it certainly is. It was a very weird thing, and it's the most extraordinary. Sort of the concept of open fingering on a brass, or it was eventually a brass type instrument. I'm not made of brass, but and these are all modern, copies in sort of fiberglass resin and things like that. But fascinating. So I played crumb horns and cornemuses and all kinds of weird sort of buzzy things. But they're great stuff and lovely music. So yes, it's certainly an interesting a sort of historical sort of framework, and of course it sort of flowed seamlessly into that sort of the early Baroque and then into later Baroque, and you can actually see quite all those dances that form the sort of Baroque instrumental suites basically all come from those Renaissance dances of that slightly earlier era. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf with a break.
ACZ with a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, thanks. VK3AML in the group with VK3ECG from VK3ACZ. Just one thing quick that David said much earlier. He mentioned the PTSD type thing about the experience on the Titanic. I was thinking strongly in both tonight's interviews and last week with the Carpathia, something that rang very strongly with me was survivor guilt and what some must have felt, the fortunate ones to get in the lifeboats that left half filled and all that. I can't begin to imagine the consequences that it must have been left on people's psyches as a result of that whole thing. And it's not just that, the sheer craziness of the not enough lifeboats to go around, and with this, I believe, fanciful idea that the Titanic was completely unsinkable. But that's not what I was going to say. David, my comment is for you. I was listening to your English accent, and I was reminded that it's only a few weeks ago that I finally got my first grey line contact with well, actually, it was a 5-9 both-way contact with Birmingham in England on the afternoon grey line on 40 metres. But I just realised something else. I looked you up on QRZ, and now I know who you are. Not only have I seen you on TV, but I used to know an associate of yours, one Malcolm Dodd. I'm just wondering, is he still working with you? And what can you elucidate about that there, David? but I'll put it back to Chris because he's the frequency holder. VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
I'll say no to that. I'll hand it straight to David. Look, don't think of me as the frequency holder, for goodness sake. Nobody owns frequencies here. This is all socialistic. Over to you, David. VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf. Yes, absolutely. No, well, indeed, I do know Malcolm very well. Yes, Malcolm is. I was going to say he's still working with us, but he is at that point where he is sort of retiring and so on. I bet I've cut my days down a bit now, and in fact I think we're due to have a sort of a dinner with him, and in fact at the end of the month. So yeah, absolutely. So, and he's still he doesn't do radio stuff per se, but he still collects a lot of early medical equipment, and I think he's got into some interesting little clocks, which VK3DOC, another person used to work with, who used to work with us until he retired recently, and he's been very active in that space as well, Morris. And I think he and Morris have been sort of exchange odd bits and pieces, and Morris fixes the old thing that Malcolm turns up. So absolutely, he's I still catch up with Malcolm quite a bit, but he's been on a bit of leave, sort of using up, I think, sort of leave at the end, sort of the end of his career, if you know what I mean. But yeah, no, it's certainly was certainly an interesting place where we do our thing. But yes, I think you're right. that sort of, I'm sure there would have been a great deal of survivor guilt in relation to what was going on, and it must have been quite sort of random in some ways. You know, whether you were in a lifeboat that overturned, whether you were you know, what resources were on the lifeboat, and you know, there would have been huge variability in people's ability to cope with the cold and things like that. But people in the water really, they really would have, I think, perished fairly quickly. I mean, it's a matter of almost minutes, I suspect, in those sorts of temperatures for those sort of people, particularly as so many of them were so unprepared for what happened. But anyway, back to you, Peter. VK3ACZ from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yeah, VK3ECG in the group from VK3ACZ. Oh, well, thank you so much for that, David. And yes, I did, somewhere in my bookshelf, I still have Malcolm's book where he was describing his adventures in the Solomon Islands and over in the Balkans, and not for the faint-hearted, definitely. A lot of the work that you people do, and very important, of course, but it would... well, I'd be stating the obvious to say that you're specially made for it. I'm sure that it's not the sort of work that just anybody could do, and thank you so much for what you do. Anyway, I'll go back to listening on the side and concur with all the comments. And yeah, it's great to be having this three-way conversation tonight. And yeah, you never know who you're going to turn up, whether it's at a hamfest or on air. Just another one of the things I love about amateur radio. Over to you, Chris, VK3AML in the group, VK3ACZ.
Yes, indeed. Well, actually, I started off this streaming as an extension of the Saturday night transmissions I do on ham radio, because, of course, the range of them is very limited on VHF to around 100 kilometres around Melbourne. But quite apart from that, I noted, listening to various bands, that people didn't get on to converse because they had nothing to talk about. So I decided that maybe it might be worthwhile running some sort of a track tour to get some thought patterns going and start conversations afterwards. I perhaps should shorten the recorded material and to, instead of 11 o'clock, 10:30 maybe, and then start the conversations then, before the average person, not a night owl like obviously we are, drops away. I noticed the number on the stream now is down to 9, and I suspect that's because a lot of people go to bed at around this time. That business of survivor guilt is an interesting one. My father suffered from it for most of his adult life because of the particular circumstances of his experiences of the Second World War. My father was a teacher pre-war. He was born in 1908. So when he signed up in 1940, he was 32. And he joined up with a number of former teachers and students of Haileybury College, which then in those days was at Brighton Beach. And he joined the army, went to what's now known as Puckapunyal. It was then called Seymour Army Camp. Did his basic training and was unhappy with the way that they were kept waiting around at Seymour for posting. So sometime in the middle or later part of 1940, he transferred from the army to the Air Force. The rest of the guys in his army division who didn't transfer were in 8th Division of AIF. Now, I don't know whether you know much about the history of the Second World War, but the 8th Division was sent, wait for it, to defend Singapore. And about 90% of them became prisoners of war and died on the Burma Railway. And my dad had to survive with feelings of guilt that he was one of the very few survivors because he transferred at a crucial time. Had he not transferred, I would not be sitting here now. I would never have existed. He didn't do well as a pilot in the Air Force, I should add. He was fairly uncoordinated, as I am. But he had an interest in science, so they put him in the meteorological service, and he really enjoyed his time as a weatherman, even when the Japs were dropping bombs on him when he was doing weather forecasting at Port Moresby during the war and later during the Battle of the Coral Sea. So Dad had to live with survivor guilt. He would frequently recall his best friend Jimmy Dickinson, who was the son of the headmaster of Haileybury at the time that he was there in the early 20s. And he maintained contact with the Dickinson family after Jimmy was killed when Singapore was overrun. Can't have been easy. VK3CG and group. I'm getting very serious for a Saturday night. VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML and VK3ECG with ACZ inside. Yes, it's fascinating, isn't it? And those stories and those sort of serendipitous decisions that people make and not really knowing what those consequences be are fascinating. And yes, I think we share that. I think my father was born in the same year, might have been just before, but he had actually had a bit of trouble at time of listing because he was a bit too old, really, as things came along. And I don't think he was in the RAF too, and was in Iceland for quite a long time. Something to do with, I think, looking for submarines that were coming across, and they were dropping these little transponder devices. In fact, I think a lot of the planes up in Iceland were actually some of the Tiger Moths, because they were just little spotter planes that you used to drop these sort of submarine detecting things that just, I think, bleeped away a bit and then just sank to oblivion. I don't know much about them, but and then I think he was in transport for a while and intelligence for a while and things like that. So I don't think he really did much flying at all. But yeah, so they actually sort of these. I've got an interesting picture of him actually sitting in a. I think it's a Hamden or something like that, but he wasn't a pilot of those sort of planes. But he had the typical RAF moustache and things like that. But yes, and Peter in relation, yes, Malcolm Dodd did a lot of stuff in the Solomons and so on, and and we still do a fair bit in sort of Pacific Islands and things like that from time to time. And it's extraordinary the sort of things that do take you around the place. Of course, one of the interesting things about the COVID, of course, is that I don't think there has been much in the way of those sort of disaster type sort of events, particularly those relating to transport, because of course there's been far less aviation going on in that sense. We haven't really had those sorts of incidents that do crop up sort of unfortunately fairly regularly, and not all of them, of course, make the news. Yes, I suppose it is a somewhat somber subject, but it is really just a part of what normally happens, and we just get on with it. I think that's the sense of it. It's amazing though how some particular incidents draw an interesting sort of, I suppose, interest, and it's not necessarily a purient interest. It's just they captured the imagination, and I think that's part of the Titanic. I mean, ships have been sinking regularly, but there was so much about that, both from a social point of view as well as the technical point of view, that I think, with the sort of expectations and so on about the modern era of sailing and transport and how safe it was. And I suppose this really sort of shocked people and challenged people in a way that perhaps other events hadn't done so. But a fascinating topic, absolutely, and fascinating to hear those eyewitness accounts and so on of those things. Anyway, back to you, Chris. VK3AML, VK3 Echo Charlie Golf with VK3 AC7 on the side.
I'm just listening there to see if there are any other breakers. VK3 Echo Charlie Golf, VK3AML. Look, just as a matter of interest, if you're into that sort of the musical side, this may be of interest. This is something that I found in searching the British Library's audio holdings online. Among the earliest surviving serious orchestral recordings were some direct cut cylinders made on an odd format, a thing called the Edison concert cylinder, which was a cylinder about 5 inches in diameter, really big. And the idea of that was to have a faster surface speed under the needle so that the frequency response was correspondingly broader, particularly at the high end. And to demonstrate the quality of that as an early hi-fi, if you will, format in 1899, the Edison Company in London invited members of the prestigious New Queen's Hall Light Orchestra, later conducted by Sir Henry J. Wood, into the studio. And these recordings made as one-offs have been sought for a very, very long time. And one has turned up, and this is it, Invitation to the Waltz, which I know is an old Weber potboiler, but I find this fascinating. Listen to this. This is from 1899. Not in great condition.
Weber's Invitation to the Waltz, played by the London Regimental Band, all printed by members of the Queen's Hall Orchestra.
Recorded in 1899, members of the new Queen's Hall Light Orchestra added to what they called the London Regimental Band, which was actually the name they gave to any musicians that happened to be in Edison's studio at the time, VK3CG, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML, VK3ECG, VK3ACZ. Yes, what a fascinating recording. Yes, I mean, you can actually, as far as I can tell from my radio here, you certainly can tell. I think there's certainly a wider frequency range. Again, I suppose a faster cylinder would have permitted that. But I think it is interesting. You talk about with the band and the light orchestra. Really, from my listening, I can hear a lot of band. It's a bit more like a concert band, and the concept of the orchestra in terms of, say, a stringed type orchestra was almost, I suppose, invisible in the sound. If I can use it, if I can mix the sort of the senses there, you really don't get a sense of it. And of course, there was a lot of arrangements of music, wasn't there, that were made and converted essentially into wind band or small wind groups because they could drive a pressure of sound and therefore be recorded in a way that the more softer strings and the more classic sort of string orchestra was simply not going to, I was going to say not going to cut it, but of course that would have been almost the reality of the recording techniques, I suppose. But yes, a well-known piece. Back to you, Chris, from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Have we got any other breakers there? VK3CG and VK3AML standing by. No, doesn't sound like it. VK3 ECG, VK3AML. Yeah, that was, as I say, an Edison concert cylinder, 5-inch diameter thing. They didn't last long as a format because rather fragile, rather breakable, and cumbersome. They were notably used by an anthropologist in Australia in 1901 named Walter Baldwin Spencer to make some of the earliest recordings of Aboriginal songs when he took that particular machine, surprisingly, on the back of a camel to Alice Springs and recorded Aranda tribesmen in 1901. So the format's been used for all sorts of odd things apart from serious classical music. And unfortunately, those 5-inch records were never mass-produced, never moulded. They were always individually recorded, which meant that their cost was relatively huge compared to a standard cylinder. So very few people had them, and even fewer have survived because they're made of a material that looks and probably moulds like beeswax. But it's interesting that as time goes on and more digitization goes on, a lot of the more obscure recordings are emerging from the dimness. And once they're on internet, as we are at the moment, it instantaneously becomes worldwide accessible. Rather good. A lot of films that have been thought lost have just popped up on the internet, not because major archives are putting them there, but because people are projecting them onto their walls and pointing cameras at the wall. The most extraordinary stuff I've seen of recent times, but particularly the British Library is doing a lot of digitisation of their audio, and quite a few foreign archives, but in this country we're lagging behind somewhat. I think in the National Film and Sound Archive, film has always kind of dominated the scene up there, and since the departure of Peter Burgess as their chief archivist in the early 90s, I really haven't seen somebody of talent taking over from him there. Perhaps I should tell you more off the air. If I told the full width of what I know about NFSO, I'd probably be seen as slanderous. I mean, it's great that there is a National Film and Sound Archive, but in terms of what access there is to that holding by the general public, it's less than I would hope. And the same applies to the State Library of Victoria, although I tend, when I'm called in to be on the odd occasions that I'm trustee and executor for collections, or that I'm called in to value or to curate collections of deceased collectors, and there are quite a few that are getting to the point of decease now. It's no longer fashionable to be a record collector, but some very large recordings of aging collectors exist, and I'd be kind of glad to see them preserved properly. And I generally point the collections that I see towards the State Library of Victoria purely because they stay in Melbourne, and from that point of view are subject to more scrutiny, potentially more pressure for access than we would have if they were put into Canberra. Read between the lines. VK3ECG, VK3AML.
Yes, VK3AML, VK3ECG. Yes, I think I understand what you mean. Yes, it is interesting when you do have those sort of collections either come to light or they, you want to know what to do with them. And certainly, actually, in my work, we've actually passed things on to the State Library rather than hold things ourselves. And that relates to sort of Australian historical events and objects that relate to those events that, for various reasons, we've done some historical work on in my field, and that means what you do with that sort of material. And the State Library has been very good in that respect, actually, and has provided us with that sort of long-term storage and also a proper process of conservation and so on, and preservation, which is so important. I was listening to something on the radio today about archaeology and the differences between restoration, preservation, conservation or something. It was actually quite interesting looking at what the differences are, and I think there was a reference to the George Bernard Shaw quote. I'm just trying to think of the actual quote now, and it's just escaping me. I think it's something like those who remember the past, control the future, and something like that, I think. And those in the some of the present. I can't remember now. I'll have to go and look it up because it was a very good one. I'm going to use it somewhere in some talk or other. but it's a classic thing. Those similar in a similar vein to those who study the past are or don't study the past are doomed to repeat it, and that's so true. And you see that in so many different ways. But yeah, it's fascinating that people think that people were able to take those very fragile instruments, cylinders and so on those extraordinary expeditions and so on. I think the shift away from those sort of mechanical recording systems has just opened up so much possibility. And unfortunately, of course, it means there's so much data now. The ability to actually control it is so different. I mean, the systems now are people having, individuals now wearing these strange brooches where they record whatever it is, a minute or a few seconds of every hour of their day, and they wear these things all the time. And I remember the CCTV issue in the UK for a while when they put so much CCTV up, or it was said you could not walk more than 100 yards without being picked up on several cameras anywhere in the country, including some distant, country roads, which used to have these strange poles with cameras on them. And the system largely failed at the end of the day, not because they couldn't do it technically, but at that time, the AI systems were such that they required so many people to monitor these cameras that it became simply impossible for them to be used in the way they were intended. I suppose the AI systems now will of course start to make those things more usable than they were in those days. Anyway, back to you, Chris, from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf, and then I think I might have to go to bed too. Okay, over to you, Chris, from VK3 Echo Charlie Golf.
Yeah, I thought I heard a very low heterodyne there. Does anybody else want to come in on the conversation? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima standing by. There might have been a hint of a carrier there, but it's very low wherever it is. So you might care to try again, whoever the station was, and we'll give it a try. But at the moment, I just can't copy. Yeah, I think the Bernard Shaw quote was something to the effect of, those who forget history, those who forget the lessons of history are bound to repeat them. And I certainly know that the outstanding example of that being put into practice was when the Allies opened up the concentration camps in Germany and points east. General Eisenhower sent in as many cameramen and newsreel units as were possible to lay his hands on and got them to film what they found within days of the liberation of the camps, so that mankind as a whole could never deny it and could never repeat it. I've seen some of the unedited newsreel footage of the opening of Belsen and various other concentration camps, and they are among the most horrendous pieces of film ever shot. And many years ago, gosh, this brings back memories. I was friendly with a university lecturer at Melbourne Uni named Stephen Murray Smith, and he was the reigning expert on the Bass Strait Islands, where I lived for the earlier part of my life. Flinders Island was my first home away from the family home. But I went, I had been involved with making a 10 LP set, or remastering for a 10 LP set for EMI, of the work of the Australian baritone Peter Dawson, born in 1882, and this was intended for release on the centenary of his birth, 1982. And I was invited to a lunch with people that were interested in Dawson at the University Staff Club at Melbourne Uni. And I met a couple of members of staff. I don't remember what the name was, but one particular chap had been a bit of a conscientious objector during the Second World War and had got around the business of actually serving in combatant units by taking the alternative and going into the medical corps. And as such, he was sent into Belsen as one of the first group of medicos to go in treating people, and it shattered him. He could not watch those films without the nightmares coming back. And he told me that his wife told him that he'd occasionally, even at that time, 1980, 40 years after the event, he'd wake up screaming. So these things can take a very long toll on you. But I think it's necessary that those films do get shown, even to young people, as a matter of sensitizing them to the possibilities, the horrendous possibilities where totalitarian regimes desensitize people to the exclusion of certain races, religions, nationalities, as we've seen recently with Mexico, as we've seen recently with certain countries in the Middle East, as we saw during the Second World War with Jews. Sorry, getting very deep, shouldn't. I'll hand it back to you, Dave, perhaps to round it off for a final. It is midnight. VK3 ECG, VK3AML.
Yeah, VK3AML, VK3SCG. Yes, I did have a listen before. I couldn't hear. I thought at first I could hear something vaguely, but I don't think I got anything. So I'm not sure there was anybody there. But I'm not in the world's greatest location, so there may have been someone there I couldn't hear. Yes, I'm still trying to find this George Burchell quote. It's extremely annoying because he made lots and lots of quotes about past, present, and future. This is a particularly good one. I shall find it in due course. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the importance of understanding the past and to acknowledge, what people, can do and what people are prepared to tolerate in extraordinary circumstances. And that's a sense is part of what we try to do today. And when people complain about journalism and all things go with journalism, it is holding up a mirror and it is trying to at least remind us of what does happen. Even though, of course, the perceptions and viewpoints on it might be quite different from different people's perspectives, it is vital that people understand. And in some ways, I suppose, the opening of communications with a lot of internet issues has given more scope for that, but at the same time, it also lends an ability to increase, distortion of facts in a similar way. It's all about power at the end of the day, isn't it? And there's not much. All you can do is keep telling the stories, and the stories, I think, are very, very revealing. Anyway, I think I better disappear. I have a few interesting things and things to sort out for tomorrow, so I've got to get some sleep. But it's been fantastic hearing the archival stuff, Chris, and also to chat about some interesting things, both musical and technical and historical. So I'll wish you 73s, and no doubt we'll catch up again at some stage, and have a pleasant rest of the weekend. So VK3AML from VK3 ECG, and we're going to it now. Cheers, Chris.
3ACZ.
Yes, Peter.
Thank you, Chris. A VK3 ECG in the group from VK3ACZ. Wanted to say 7-3 to you, David. Great to have made your acquaintance on the air for the first time. I'm not that far away. QRZ says we're 17k apart as the crow flies, but you're 15 over 9 here in Baronia. Really good signal. And you probably meet with enough doctors you probably don't want to be reminded of anymore, but I've only spoken to one other that I'm aware of, VK8 Kilo Mike Delta up in Alice Springs. Greg, he's a retired flying doctor. I speak to him occasionally on 20 metres. Don't know if you've made his acquaintance, but that might be one to file in the memory bank if you haven't. And that is, as I said, if you're not worn out from talking to doctors. So good to have had you on the broadcast. Don't know how often you've listened to Chris, but funny him talking before about the National Film and Sound Archive. I was starting to think Chris was the National Film and Sound Archive, hi, because there's some amazingly good stuff that comes up week after week. I don't know how he does it, but it's pretty good. And I hope you're a regular listener, or if you haven't been, that you will be. But anyway, look, I'll say 7-3 to you as well there, Chris, and just say thanks once again for another quality broadcast, well worth staying up for, and all the rest of it. And glad you're getting the feedback from people via the online stuff too, that this stuff deserves. It's certainly thought-provoking, it's certainly interesting, and may there be lots more of it. Anyway, I'll catch you for next week's broadcast, if not before, Chris, and 7-3 to you both. VK3 ECG, VK3AML, and VK3ACZ going clear.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Any final comment, Dave?
No, that's fine. Well, thanks very much, Peter. Yes, I'll keep an ear open, and thanks very much for all your comments. Fantastic. No doubt we will speak again sometime soon. So VK3 ACG, now QRT. Good night, all.
No worries, Peter, and no worries, Dave. And please note, I believe Steve 3SL listens to this program, but he is tied up with family things on a Saturday night, so he usually leaves a recorder running and listens to it another night. So good evening to you too, Steve, when you eventually hear this. Do we have any other breakers before I close? VK3 Alpha Mike Lima listening on 147.475 and looking and reading the text on the YouTube live stream. Anybody on 147.475? Nope, nothing heard. Anyway, with that, what'll I do to close? We can do a test with something. For the hell of it, what shall I play? What shall I play? The second recording of Stardust by Hoagie Carmichael as played by McKinney's Cotton Pickers, 1930. This is so hi-fi, it'll blow my mind. Compared to anything that we've played earlier tonight. This is just purely as a test to close. VK3 Alpha Mike Lima.